some of our regulars attending, which is lovely. Thank you so much for joining us on a regular basis, because it really, what we're trying to do here is give everybody through our webinars an insight into the wider world of FASD. And it isn't the doom and gloom that everyone felt for so many years. Everything seemed to be negative about it. They didn't look at the positives, and there are so many positives. Today, the nature of the subject that we're going to be talking about is FASD in the criminal justice system. And this is where so often it's a lack of understanding of the condition FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, that leads to either a lack of understanding when it comes to the complex needs of that individual that has transitioned from childhood through to adulthood, that is vulnerable in the extreme, and has put them in a position that is led them into the criminal justice system. At FASD Awareness, our charity, and when we speak amongst the FASD UK Alliance, we know that this is a very, very important subject. Now, I am absolutely delighted to introduce to this evening Gilbert. And Gilbert and I, we've had discussions on this subject in the past over projects that we're working on at FASD Awareness. And Gilbert is at the forefront of a lot of the research that is being done on this particular subject in this country. Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us. Lovely to see you here tonight.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you for having me.
And first of all, I said to you just before we came on air, when you read your CV, it's a real mix of different jobs and roles that you actually perform. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on what you do, what your role is? Because obviously your PhD, which we'll be coming on to in a bit, really shot you into the stardom of the FASD community. But can you tell us a little bit about how you got here and what your roles are now?
Well, thank you, Andrew. Firstly, I think I would want to describe myself as a PhD researcher, because I think every other thing sort of stems from there. I am actually researching FASD and the criminal justice system at the University of Salford. And alongside that, I also am an hourly paid lecturer within the School of Health and Society. I take a few classes, a few lectures here and there with students in psychology and public health. Just because my PhD is interdisciplinary, I'm able to teach psychology and public health and also contribute to modules such as forensic psychology. I'm also an associate fellow of the Higher Education Academy, which sort of demonstrates my role as a teacher within higher education. And then from then on, I also have another role with the doctoral school, which is the lead of the International Postgraduate Researchers, where I help the university understand what it is the institution needs to do to support postgraduate researchers who are of international origin. So I think that's really just a brief of what I do within the University of Salford.
That's brilliant. And of course, at the moment, of course, University of Salford seems to be one of the main centres focusing on FASD. We have other universities up and down the country that are doing an awful lot of research around this material and this subject, and all power to them. But I know up in Manchester and Salford, that seems to be a centre. What got you involved in FASD in the very first instant?
Thank you, Andrew. I think that question really, I always love to answer that question. And that was because it sort of really goes down to my background. So my first degree was in biochemistry. I trained as a biochemist, after which I went into the pharmaceutical industry. And with that, I became a medical representative for a pharmaceutical company based in, actually is based in Germany, but then they had a branch of in Nigeria at the time, because I studied in Nigeria. I'm originally from Nigeria. I worked with them for 5 years, and the franchises I was in charge of included medications for people who were terminally ill, who were, within the realms of oncology, that's cancer, virology, that's illnesses caused by viruses. And those were the kind of medications I was in charge of. And I think at the time, my learnings from there, looking back now, is the power of a correct diagnosis. And I did realize what the potential positive impact of a correct diagnosis would be for a patient. And I had the scholarship to come study at the University of Salford. And at the time, I was in search of a project topic. And I think one of the things that really struck me about FASD was, while I was reading in search of a topic, I realized there were loads of issues around misdiagnosis, and underdiagnosis. And from my experience in the pharmaceutical in the pharmaceutical industry, I already knew that, well, this is something worth researching. And that started the fire, that keeps the fire burning. And I think up till now, that has kept me going, because I sort of appreciate how this can impact patients. So I think that's really where the interest started from.
And who did you study under? Who were your greatest influences and your supporters really around your PhD?
Yeah, I think I would say I'm really, really, I don't want to say the luckiest, but one of the luckiest PhD researchers around, because I've sort of had the privilege to learn from the experts per se. Firstly, I got in contact with Professor Penny Cook at the University of Salford, because I think she leads the team at the university. And from then on, my PhD supervisory team sort of extended to people like Professor Raja Mukherjee, who is the national leading expert in FASD. And then I also have Professor Claire Lely, who is also an expert in autism per se, but has special interest in FASD. And that sort of mix really has sort of built me into what I am today. Professor Penny is a professor in public health, while Professor Claire is a forensic psychologist. Professor Raja is a consultant psychiatrist. So I've had this kind of really mix that has sort of been very impactful in my research journey.
And also the timing of it for you must be crucial, because we've seen 15 plus years of indifference within the FASD community. And all of a sudden, the hard work that groups have been putting in for years is coming finally to fruition. And there's a real sense of hope. And I know many of those that have attended our webinars will have heard from Raja Mukherjee and Sandy Butcher of the National Organization of FASD, and many of the leading lights of the FASD community. So you get a sense really of how exciting things are. And of course, you've studied with the leading lights in the medical profession around FASD that have led the way for many years. So, obviously it's a very exciting time for you. So can you tell us what your PhD was on and why you chose that subject?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I would make reference to your last statement. Yes, I would actually really privileged again in terms of the timing of my PhD. And it gives me a sense of very deep humility and respect for organizations like yourselves, the National Organization for FASD, and many of the experts upon whom my research currently stands upon. And, I pay that due respect to them, because I know without all the hard work you have put in so far, it would be really impossible to have the level of results we have, or the level of interest in the research I am doing. So back to the question about my PhD, I've actually, over the past 3 to 4 years, been studying on the vulnerabilities of individuals of FASD to and within the criminal justice system. Just to put that into a bit of a clearer narrative, I've been interested in exploring the factors that predispose this population to encounters with the justice system. And that is from the backdrop of international evidence that has really showed us or demonstrated that individuals with FASD are 19 times more likely to be incarcerated. They are 19 times more likely to be arrested by the police. They are 19 times more likely to be imprisoned by the justice system. So that's sort of the foundation of my work. And it sort of has really developed that curiosity in me to find out what exactly are the factors that sort of lead to this high rates of incarceration, this more likelihood of them being within the justice system. So that's what my PhD has studied over the past 3 years, I would say.
And with that, can you explain what your findings were in the end? Or can you talk to us a little bit, first of all, before you go into your findings, what you felt in your initial research that you needed to do? What research did you need to cover to discover your findings? And how did you go about doing that?
Thank you, Andrew. I think, firstly, I did start off my research journey during my MSc with social workers. I did explore their experiences of working with children suspected or who have a diagnosis of FASD and what, they actually perceived working with these children were. And from there, I really got a sense of what it is like in terms of the pathway to encounters with the justice system, because we know that, one of the greatest factors that lead children into care is substance abuse, parental substance abuse. And that sort of nudged me down the path of the justice system because it's all along that pathway. Starting out on the PhD journey, I think my first point of call was to first of all understand exactly what the level of evidence is in terms of what are the real experimental studies we have so far in terms of the encounters of this population with the justice system. And what I then had to do was to do a systematic review, which sort of tried to identify what existing studies we already had on the encounters of individuals with FASD and the justice system. And I know sat in this call are professionals, legal professionals, and people from law enforcement. And I think one thing we know with the justice system is there are different points of contact, but a very crucial point is actually that point where individuals are being questioned in the form of interrogative interviews. And that's really where my research sits. How do individuals with FASD perform during questioning? How do they perform when forensic interviewers question them about either their involvement in crime or their sort of status as witnesses or victims of crime? And we know again, sorry.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. And this is exactly the point that we hear from us when we do our one-to-one clinics, when we're talking to families that are most in need and desperate. They can see the potential of getting involved in the criminal justice system is happening. There's this risk, the vulnerability is there. But then once they're in that system, it is so hard for them to come out. So the fact that you identify that as being one of the key elements is such an important point. Can I just come in very quickly on this point? How did all these other services engage with you when you were asking these questions? Were they aware of FASD? Were they, because I know we talk to a lot of different professional sectors, and even now we're still having to explain what FASD is. What was your experience of that?
So I think the professionals I did research on, that's the social workers, during my MSc research. The paper is now published. It's of any good. It's titled Exploring the Experiences of Social Workers Working with Children with FASD, and that's the title of the publication. I think one thing that really stood out was the low level of knowledge among these professionals. And one of the arguments in that paper is actually inclusion of more training for these professionals in their curriculum while they study for their degrees. Because it was really amazing to see that many of the professionals who took part in the research, who I did talk to, who I did interview, actually were part of things like removal teams who were involved in removing children from their parents. And they really weren't aware of some of the challenges, or in fact, they weren't aware of FASD at all. And then it now just led to things like blaming the parents for poor parenting, and just, things like administering interventions that were really generic rather than, thinking around and developing interventions that were FASD tailored. So I think for me, I would say the greatest learning from talking to these services, to these professionals, was actually the low level of knowledge about FASD, which I think is really a challenge in many of these cycles still now, just like you've confirmed.
Absolutely. And, it's very interesting that you would reinforce exactly what we've all experienced, and many of the families have experienced for so many years. And these battles that we all talk about, battling against the system, when now we're looking at focusing through the NICE guidelines on a person-centered approach, understanding the individual. We had Raja on a few months ago, and he was saying it's person-centered. It's understanding that individual, getting that wraparound system around that individual, because every case is different. But understanding the umbrella term of FASD is important. It's imperative to be able to support the family networks and, more importantly, that individual. So I'm going to come back, if I may, to where you ended up with your identifying the key area that you wanted to tap in on. So with that, what did you find? You'd identified that it was actually as they came into custody, that process of interview. Can you explain what the existing process is, and then go into maybe explaining how that might be detrimental to an individual with FASD?
Yes, I think, like you say again, really investigative interviews seem to be really crucial for me, because based on the literature and in practice, we know that a lot of times that particular stage of encounter many times will impact even the outcome in terms of sentencing and what the future of that individual is within the justice system. And while there are different systems around the world, we know that firstly, one of the things that would happen would be a recitation of the right to remain silent to whoever is being approached by criminal justice professionals or law enforcement per se. But again, at that stage, this individual is told they have all the rights to remain silent. Whatever they say can be used against them. One thing we know with individuals of FASD, again, from international evidence, is the fact that that comprehension, that ability to even understand what the wording of this particular right is actually really, really low. And just a bit of backdrop to how this came about, I think we know that in settings like the US, is referred to as Miranda rights, and it just stems up from the investigative interview of a vulnerable young man for about 2 hours without legal counsel, which then led to, outcomes that were really pleasant. And it then became a sort of procedural safeguard, as it's called, to protect people who are vulnerable from self-incriminating statements. But with this population, with individuals of FASD, we actually know that comprehending this right, understanding of this right to remain silent is really poor. So from that stage on, it sort of opens them up to more unpleasant outcomes, because the comprehension is low. They give in to being interrogated or interviewed without appropriate counsel or without appropriate adults. The interviewing takes place, and then the plethora of vulnerabilities, which I have been researching, then begin to sort of, become really, really obvious to professionals who really may not even, identify that these vulnerabilities exist.
And of course, there are so many that will come into custody that will have that misdiagnosis. So, for example, they won't have FASD as an umbrella term. They might well have FASD, but might have a diagnosis of ADHD, might have a diagnosis of ASD, but not the umbrella term of FASD. So they have no idea they have FASD. And there are so many within the population that are believed to have FASD. Now, because of their vulnerability, they would have been wrapped up in the criminal justice system, and they would have fallen foul, if you like, of this procedure of actually not understanding what is being asked of them when they come in. We've spoken on many of our webinars with some fascinating individuals with FASD, and they talk to us about their experiences, and they talk to us about this. If they're accused of stealing something at home, they don't see it as stealing. They've even forgotten about that. They've forgotten what it was about. Their memory their short-term memory had negated that. So therefore, they're now thinking, I'm fight or flight. And this is something that comes up time and time again and incriminates the individual. Can you talk a little bit about your findings on this?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So my interest, first of all, was generally psychological vulnerabilities within this population. And just by definition, most of my work refers to the research being done on the neurotypical population by Professor Gilbert, who actually happens to have done a lot of work around vulnerabilities of individuals within the justice system. I've used some of the tools he developed, things like the Gudjonsson suggestibility scale, which is used to identify people who are vulnerable during interrogation. So the first vulnerability I've found using this scale is actually the vulnerability of being very, very, just susceptible to accepting suggestions from forensic interviewers. And what happens with this tool is I sit with a young person and I tell them a short story, which is really just less than a minute long. And then after this storytelling phase, I then say to the young person, can you retell that story to me? Can you tell me exactly what happened or what you heard from that story? And then I listen carefully, I record what they tell me. Now, as soon as they finish, I then tell them, okay, take a 50 minutes break, come back to me after 50 minutes. Can you tell me that story again? And I listen to what they say. I record that second part of the conversation. Now, I have two versions of what they've told me. Now, what I'm trying to measure from there is how much do they really remember from what I told them? How much do they confabulate from what I've told them? So confabulation is just replacement of memory gaps with imaginative stories. So that's also another vulnerability I found in the FASD population. So at the end of that, I then asked them 20 questions. 15 of those questions are leading questions. And this is from the tool, it's a standardized forensic tool. 15 of those questions actually are suggestive. They never happened in the story in reality. It's just to see if the young person will just accept those suggestions as reality. Now, at the end of that, I say to the young person, well, you've made a mistake in some of the answers you've told me. We need to go over these questions once more. Please try and be more accurate than you were at the first round. Then I ask them the same 20 questions and note their answers. Now, I've got two versions of answers, Andrew. The first version, actually, I am looking at, did they yield to those 15 questions that were suggestive? After that, I've said to them, you made a mistake. Now, the second version of their answers, I'm then looking at to measure if they've first of all yielded to the 15 questions more due to the negative feedback I've given them, or did they shift their answers from a yes to a no, or from a no to a yes, or did they remain mute? So all of this give me an idea of, firstly, the extent of memory recall, secondly, the extent of confabulation. And confabulation is a construct I measure from distortion and fabrication. So distortion is to what extent did they actually misconstrue facts? Fabrication is to what extent did they actually create new materials that never existed into the story? Then from the questioning phase, I'm able to check to what extent they yielded to my suggestions while I was questioning them. Then I measured the extent of shift, therefore giving me total suggestibility. In the FASD population, I did find very, very remarkable scores when differences between the FASD population and my controls. They easily had very high suggestibility scores. They yielded more to my questions. They yielded more to interrogative pressure. They had very unique confabulation styles that were not seen in the control. So, I mean, the deviation from the original story was really remarkable. And then they developed arguments to support even the questions they had admitted to that were not true. I don't know if that is clear enough, Andrew.
Absolutely. No, that's fascinating. In fact, an anonymous attendee has said confabulation makes it virtually impossible for young people with FASD to get justice when they are the victims of crime, because part of their story will be evidently false, and thus police and the CPS will determine the evidence is too contestable to secure a prosecution. So that sums up basically what you are saying about the confabulation. Now, the other thing is what the contradictions. I'm sure you'll explain more about this, but the contradictions, it doesn't depend on an IQ, does it? IQ has very little to do with this, or does it? Can you explain a little bit about that side of it? Because I know when there's a suggestion put forward, an IQ can actually come up with a very, very clever response. It might not be the right response, but it's a clever response. Is that the case?
Thank you, Andrew. I think that sort of really touches on the other measures I did employ during the research. So I did measure IQ levels too as well. And it's remarkable to find out that really within the FASD population, I did find a range of IQs, as research has established before mine. But what really what stood out for me was the fact that none of the IQ levels went below 70. And this is really important because, the contributor just mentioned about confabulation. We know that, confabulation is a real major, it's a big issue, it's a big source of contamination when it comes to the giving of testimonies or receipt of testimonies from professionals. Now, none of those IQs went below 70. And we know that, one of the points held with, used by professionals to identify vulnerability is IQ. So IQs below 70 are considered, really vulnerable and in need of support. But despite all the vulnerabilities I've mentioned to you, high interrogative suggestibility scores, high yield to suggestive questioning, high shift, and high confabulation, they did demonstrate IQs that would not, present them as vulnerable to the justice system, which is a big issue because, going through that process without the needed support presents in itself a very big source of vulnerability, which may, just produce outcomes that are not, fair in that sense.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, we've got the whole area of fluctuating capacity as well. We are having to manage capacity and understand, do they have the understanding, the wherewithal to understand what is being asked of them? And in a frenzied moment where they're in a panic, they have a fluctuating capacity. Later on, they might be able to answer those, as you've said yourself, answering the questions with a different emphasis on them is going to get different results. So, fluctuating capacity. I know we had this conversation with Raja some months ago as well. It's a crucial part of an FASD's individual's experiences.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. And I think with the research I have done across my PhD, it's really it really sort of, as a researcher, I think it really touches to the core of my conscience to say, All of these assessments were done remotely, if you see what I mean. They were all home-based. They had the support of many times their parents or carers. And one thing we know from research about interrogative suggestibility is some of the factors that sort of you really pronounce that vulnerability is the fact that there has to be high uncertainty, high interpersonal trust, and, that high level of anxiety and, low coping strategy. And that really was not obtainable because he was in a remote environment. He was over a screen. They had the support of their parents. Now, we then ask ourselves what would happen in the real scenario where you've got, justice professionals in their uniforms, police officers, forensic interviewers, maybe in a closed room with probably no much lighting or whatever the condition is. I think we will suspect that things like anxiety would increase, things like, uncertainty will be on the high, and then that vulnerability will then come into play. And that's when, we can then see that fluctuating capacity in real display, because definitely if the tension is high, if interrogative pressure, which definitely we expect to be higher in real life scenario, then I think it sort of gives us an idea of what the potential will be of much more poorer performances.
And interestingly, an attendee has commented here as well that in law, there is no such thing as fluctuating capacity. There's either capacity or not. And so therein lies one of the greatest flaws and difficulties that our individuals are having to face. Can I move on a little bit? Because I interviewed an officer and a nurse that work in the custody suites some months, about a year ago, and we wanted to get the
sorry,
absolutely.
Andrew. Can I comment? Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to comment on the points before we move on about capacity or no fluctuating capacity. I think this is a real, just like you said, it is quite an issue that, professionals will need to really look into, because another thing that's come out of my research is the issue of frontal lobe paradox, where these young people, individuals with damage to the frontal lobe as an FASD, they could even perform well in psychological assessments, but then in daily life struggle with the same sort of exercises because of the stability in environments where these tests are conducted. But, in real life, there's a lot of chaos. They may present as really, really powerful speakers. They could be very, very powerful in their narratives, but then with little understanding of what they are saying. So some of these things, I think these are gray areas that really need to be understood, because we are dealing with people or individuals. It's not putting everybody in a neat box, just the way it's classified in the book. So that's just one point I wanted to make about frontal lobe paradox and these different performances under these different conditions, and then you have the same individual. Sorry, Andrew, for interrupting.
Not at all. No. I'm really glad you did. Thank you. And I was going to say, what comes into that was when we were talking to the custody suite sergeant and to the nurse that is assigned, they assured us that the police procedure is that an individual has the right to be able to request an adult that is a responsible adult to supervise for them. Now, that could be a social worker, that could be a parent. Now, in a situation like that, if the individual has got an FASD diagnosis, we know that there are, like the autism cards. We had a foster son who, whenever he was approached by the police for whatever, he would always present proudly his autism card like his gets out of jail card. And frequently he would then be walked back to our house and the police would bring him to our house and say, so-and-so was caught up in a little incident. We know he wasn't involved, but we know where you are. So we thought we'd help him back. That autism card really helped him an awful lot because it explained exactly what his vulnerabilities and his disabilities were. Now, we've encouraged, and I noticed that actually with the National Organisation of FASD, they have on their website, on their criminal justice system section of their website, they have cards that you can download, print off, and you can take it with you anywhere. And it explains to anybody in a criminal justice system that you have FASD and these are your vulnerabilities and who to ask for when you get brought into a custody suite. So really important that. But I know the police were saying, we have all these facilities for somebody, we have these options. But the problem is so many of them, this fight or flight mechanism starts to hit in, they're not going to think of the processes or anything like that. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what you feel would be the right system from your experiences? What can change?
Yeah, I think for me, you've touched one quite, an initiative that I've seen it being advertised by the National Organization for FASD about, and the cards, which I really think would be a game changer. And personally, from I think some of the findings from my research here at the university, we are trying to work with professionals within the justice system, like the police, to create like training courses where we can sort of, first of all, pilot with a few officers we've got interest from, for instance, officers from Cumbria, and a few discussions going around with the Manchester police just to pilot this training and sort of start this awareness from that point of view. Because if professionals like the police are fully aware of FASD and the vulnerabilities, I want to believe, from the discussion so far, there's a lot of interest about, wanting to get it right, wanting to just do it right when it comes to interviewing, young people who are suspected of having FASD. So I think awareness within the system will really change a lot of things. And no small thanks to the efforts of the organizations, who have been rallying around FASD, yourselves, the National Organization for FASD, and a host of others in, just carrying out just so much of awareness activities. And we've got the nice guidelines too that's really helped us to push that awareness forward. So for me, I'm a firm believer of banging the drums continually, just keep banging it, and just having sessions like this where we could rub minds as professionals, as researchers, engage with the wider public is really important, because I think there's power in that word of mouth. There's power in just sending the word out and the public understanding what these vulnerabilities are. I think for me, these are just the two greatest points. And of course, with that, there will definitely be the increased push for diagnosis, more recognition within systems, school systems, the social services, the justice system. And these would be my top arguments, really.
And your connections with the parole service and your links within that organization. We've just had a question come in about how connected are we with FASD individuals. And I can say that over the we've been running as a charity since 2018, and we offer online support groups, one-to-one clinics for those that are most at need. And we also run friendship groups that include junior and adult friendship groups of those that have a diagnosis of FASD that come together and talk. And we learn more from them than they do from us. And there is this wealth of knowledge and understanding that they have, and they teach us. And so when we are willing to learn and willing to adapt our behaviors to accommodate them and to be able to have that person-centered approach and the wraparound service, it leads to far better outcomes. There are so many people that we have spoken to that are caught up in this criminal justice system. I got involved some years ago with a friend that came to our charity, whose son was caught up in the criminal justice system and was constantly revolving in and out. We called our case study film, and I urge you to go and look at it. It's only a 2-minute film, but it tells the story exactly of this. The vulnerable young man who just liked traveling on trains, but forgot to pay to go on those trains, built up such a huge debt. And the problem was, the local authority, social services, did not engage with him early on, ignored the advice of what sort of services he needed to interact with, and wouldn't pay for them. And so therefore he lost that engagement at that crucial age, and he got caught up in the criminal justice system. And this film that we do is called The Revolving Door. I interviewed the family and the father, the adopted father, and there was a crucial moment. They were saying they're just waiting for that phone call to say that he's passed away. And it broke my heart when I heard this. And so I became very passionate about this. We were getting more and more calls on this from desperate families. And then we saw your research, and it resonated so much with what we were hearing. And so we started talking to police chiefs within the Police Chiefs Council and talking to people working with the Home Office. And the overriding story was, I didn't know about FASD. I didn't understand this. Makes sense. Perfect sense. Yes, tell us more. And then they're engaging with us. And as you say, it's about that engagement. Get the story out there. Get the message out. If you want to pass our film around the communities to get people to understand, this is really, really important. And can you tell us a little bit about, we've worked quite a lot on different webinars in the past and interviews with the teams in Canada who are far more advanced than we are with their criminal justice system and the work they've done with their communities in Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about, because you would have tapped in on what they've been presently doing. Can you talk to us a little bit about your findings with the Canadian criminal justice system?
Yes, I think it's just been inspirational to see what the team in Canada have been up to when it comes to FASD. I've had the privilege of going through some of the resources they've put out. I think thankfully I've seen a comment in the chat from, I think, one of our attendees sending the link of the National Organization for FASD with the link to legal issues. I think they have really a bespoke website with many case laws that involve individuals with FASD and some of the judgments that have been passed, which they've really served as a foundation for some of my research. And very recently, I think I've been speaking to the team in Canada to hoping to see if we can adapt some of the work they've been doing to the UK setting. Things like the development of a screening tool for the criminal justice system. From what I gather, my contact with them is, I think they are still at the testing stage of the tool. And I feel it's really, really going to be a helpful tool if we can find a way to adapt it to our setting. I've been in touch with a few professionals here within the young people services who, things like the chat tool we have in the Youth Justice Service and things like that, which may be really adapted to help us within what the work we do here too as well.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you explain what the screening process is?
Well, it's a screening tool that is in development by the team in Canada. And I think the idea is to screen the possibility of FASD when individuals come in contact with the justice system at that point of entry. And I think my understanding of it at the moment is that with this tool, it will be really helpful to professionals to really understand, if a young person is at risk of FASD or not, which I think would be a really helpful tool if that is something we can employ within our setting. I'm still waiting for more details because I think the conversation has got to a point where they've promised to share what their findings are with the testing of the tool. So hopefully we'll get more information as we go along.
And where do you see our journey in the UK? to supporting, Jeff, who is an amazing advocate for FASD in the criminal justice system with his lived experience. He's sat on many of our sort of roundtables and our meetings around this subject. And he says, what about those with a diagnosis? What are the criminal justice system doing about those that are wrapped up in this system? What do you see for you personally? This is your own personal comment about where do you see the preferred approach moving?
Well, I think, to be honest, when we compare to settings like Canada and see the work they've done so far, I think we've got a bit, of a journey to undertake with this. And the starting point really is that awareness, and no small thanks to, like I said earlier, the activities of all these organizations. And as we keep banging the drum, the interest will be, increased, and hopefully professionals will be willing to sit at a round table and then discuss the way forward. I still feel there's still a lot to be done. For instance, we still don't know how many people within the UK justice system have FASD, which is something significant. That was actually the objective of my PhD when I started out, but I think because of the approval process, my PhD was time bound, and I've had to move and go around the issue by exploring vulnerabilities instead. And for me, I think from the standpoint of understanding how many we have in the justice system, it would really, really go a long way to, first of all, understand the scale of the issue in our hands. And then secondly, of course, I don't think it's in the interest of the public to administer interventions that are not, FASD tailored. Like you did mention about parents saying they're just waiting for that awful phone call. I think things like that, those stories, have really, really kept me going as a researcher during tough times of my PhD, because aside the forensic assessment and the psychological assessment I conducted, I also interviewed parents and these young people, and hearing those stories about how parents will say, well, other parents would be wanting their children to go to university, to have degrees. We all our lifetime ambition is to keep our children out of the justice system. That is all we live for. And it's quite touching, especially, I am a father, I've got daughters too as well. And I think, oh my God, this is, I don't think you go to sleep when you hear stories like that. And while parents of neurotypicals think of, getting a job, getting a degree, these parents here are like, look, I need to do all I can. I can't even go anywhere because I know it will be the next phone call. I'm just waiting for the next phone call from the police that he's done this or that or the other. So I think the awareness really is important, and hopefully we will get there. I'm quite an optimist. I just believe we keep going, and yes, the destination we will not be far in sight as long as we keep traveling.
You and I together, we're both optimists, and I do feel as well that having that research, getting university students like yourself to find the research, choose their research projects that can actually benefit the FASD community. It's imperative, because that data is then useful to support other avenues of training, to train the police, to train the parole services, to train the prison services, to train lawyers to understand FASD, to have their own specific lawyer that understands FASD to support them. Fantastic. This is what is being promoted and has been promoted for some time. In Canada, they have their very own FASD court. And so this is crucial, because it's like no other condition. And the vulnerabilities, as you've stated today, are there for us all to see. And surely to support those individuals, it would benefit the prison population in the future, but more importantly, those families with the most vulnerable in society. Can I also add that we've been advocates for a long time of getting early diagnosis and understanding the condition. And Raja stated in his last webinar with us that when you understand that individual and you give yourselves a level of understanding and adapt your expectations and how to communicate more effectively with that individual, you have a much greater chance of being able to advocate for them, to be able to support them through that transitioning period, that most vulnerable period in their upbringing, and be able to hopefully support them through their journeys. And we've seen it, we're seeing it constantly, that level of understanding, that early diagnosis, that early person-centered approach that hopefully we're looking at with the management plan in the fifth statement of the NICE guidelines. It's the one that was fought so hard by many of those with lived experience. That management plan is crucial, and it will have a huge impact on what we've discussed today, I'm sure, moving on. Listen, Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us today and for your research and your data that is helping support so many of the families and helping us to educate those services that need the tools to be able to support FASD individuals and families moving on. Thank you so much, Gilbert, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always a pleasure anywhere, any day, anytime to just share and just add our voices to all the hard work you have been doing another organization. So I will say thank you instead for having me. And the good news is, like you say, I'm really comforted, and I feel really excited to say our team at the University of Salford is expanding. We have I think another PhD student who is a lawyer, a solicitor, who is just starting her PhD research on FASD again and the justice system, which I think is going to be a real compliment to the research I've done so far. We've had a few other interesting conversations going on about the way forward. So hopefully, I think we would be in a much more stronger position as we go forward to, just add to that evidence base and just see which way we can contribute our quota to, just helping families and just, organizations like yourself in having that evidence, the evidence base to continue the good work, really.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing you again when you speak up at Manchester for the FASD conference up there, and hearing all the great work that's carrying out up there. So thank you once again, Gilbert. And thank you all so much for joining us today, for having a greater insight into FASD and many of the challenges that families and individuals with FASD face on a daily basis. Thank you, and keep an eye out for our next webinar, and we look forward to seeing you then. All the very best. Good night. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you again, Gilbert.
Andrew. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.